Off the remote coast of Scotland lies a cemetery surrounded by dark water and crashing against jagged cliffs. Local folklore has long warned sailors to avoid the island. Anyone who hears the faint sound of a choir singing over the water after midnight and follows that music to the shore vanishes before dawn. The government maintains a much simpler historical record. Officially, the island was permanently abandoned in 1911. The historical consensus claims a mysterious, rapid illness swept through the local village, killing the remaining inhabitants and leaving the cemetery to the elements. Investigative filmmaker Mason Brooks discovered documentation that contradicted the 1911 timeline. He unearthed 23 sealed police records, detailing modern disappearances connected to the island. Each file ended the same way: no bodies recovered, and heavy redactions covering the final notes. With 23 sealed files spanning a century, the island remained a site of recurring disappearances, none of whom had ever been found. Determined to document the truth, Brooks hired a small film crew and a local boat captain, arriving on the island shortly before sunset. The captain immediately refused to step ashore. He told the crew to gather their equipment and leave before the sun dropped below the horizon. Stepping onto the island, the crew found thousands of weathered, leaning grave markers covering the hillside. Examining the grounds, historian Sarah Mitchell noted a bizarre spatial layout. Every single grave was meticulously positioned to face precisely west, toward the open sea. There was exactly one exception. Near the center of the cemetery sat a single, uncarved, perfectly smooth headstone. It faced the opposite direction, pointing directly east toward a ruined, abandoned church that overlooked the cliffs. Mason instructed the crew to ignore the captain's warnings and press forward. As they moved toward the church, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in from the water, swallowing the island and dropping visibility to zero. The thick fog swallowed the island until visibility dropped to only a few feet, isolating the crew in the cemetery. Seeking shelter from the sudden fog, the crew entered the ruined church. The roof had collapsed and the pews were rotting away, yet near the altar stood a massive, antique pipe organ that appeared completely pristine, untouched by the decay around it. As the sound engineer, Ethan Cole, began setting up his recording equipment, a single clear piano note echoed through the empty building. Then 3 more followed, forming a slow, deliberate melody. No one was standing near the instrument. At exactly 12:11 a.m., the environment shifted. Without anyone touching the equipment, every single audio recorder and digital microphone the crew had placed throughout the church activated simultaneously. This split-screen digital readout shows a severe technological disconnect. The top half of this interface represents the video cameras, which recorded absolute silence. The bottom half displays the microphone array, which captured massive, synchronized spikes, the sound of hundreds of voices singing perfectly together. While the crew scrambled to understand the readouts, cameraman Olivia Hayes fell into a silent trance. She walked slowly out of the church, directly into the fog, stopping at the uncarved grave. She knelt in the dirt and began frantically clawing at the soil with her bare hands. Mason chased her and physically pulled her away from the dirt. The instant he broke her contact with the ground, the crashing ocean went dead silent. The magnetic compasses spun in endless circles, and every digital watch on their wrists wiped away the time, replacing the numbers with 4 letters, WAIT. Between the spinning compasses, the frozen clocks, and the silencing of the ocean, the crew's basic tools for understanding their location and time had ceased to function. Through the absolute silence, a heavy metallic toll rang out. The church bell, which the crew had seen heavily rusted and motionless hours earlier, struck 12 slow, distinct times, echoing through the heavy mist. Emerging from the dense fog, dozens of pale figures appeared between the leaning headstones. They stood entirely motionless, wearing black funeral attire spanning multiple different centuries, simply watching the crew. Panic drove the crew back into the church. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut and locked behind them. At the altar, the massive organ began playing violently on its own, keys slamming down and launching clouds of dust with every heavy chord. Searching the altar for a secondary exit, Sarah discovered a loose stone block. Hidden underneath it was a weathered leather journal. It was the final written confession of the village priest, dated 1911. The journal described how the villagers of 1911 had opened a cave beneath the graveyard after hearing echoes from the earth. They believed the music was divine, until the voices began calling them by name. One by one, they walked into the darkness and never came back. The village had not been wiped out by a plague. It had been drawn underground, lured by the same voices now echoing through the church. While Mason and Sarah examined the journal, Olivia slipped back out the front doors. She returned to the blank headstone. This time, hundreds of pale, floating spirits with pitch-black eyes emerged from the fog, flanking her on all sides. The earth cracked apart directly beneath the blank grave, revealing a steep, freezing stone staircase plunging into the darkness below. Mason descended alone, armed only with a flashlight. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into an enormous cathedral constructed entirely of black stone. Thousands of unmelting candles illuminated hundreds of people in historical clothing, standing in rigid rows, facing away from him. As Mason stepped closer, the figures turned in unison. He recognized their faces from the 23 missing persons files. A deafening choir echoed through the cavern, yet not a single person moved their mouth to sing. In the center of the crowd stood a tall figure in a priest's robe. It cast no shadow against the candlelight, and beneath the hood, Mason found only an empty black void. These victims from decades of disappearances stood in the dark, their voices continuing to resonate even though their bodies remained frozen in place, waiting for the next person to descend the stairs. Mason sprinted back up the freezing steps. He breached the surface and threw his entire body weight against the heavy stone door, slamming it shut over the grave just as the hooded figure raised a hand. When Mason turned around, the fog was entirely gone. Dawn was breaking over the Scottish coast. His crew, the local captain, and all of their camera equipment had vanished, and the church behind him was once again a collapsed, rotting ruin. This timeline displays the discrepancy uncovered by the ensuing police investigation. Mason believed his descent into the cavern lasted only a few minutes. The gap between these points reveals that he had actually been missing for 18 days. Every attempt to prove what happened failed. The 1911 journal Mason carried out of the church was completely blank, and the few damaged memory cards investigators recovered from the island contained nothing but wide shots of empty landscapes. The island operates on a separate temporal and physical reality, capable of removing physical evidence and concealing its presence from the outside world. Only one piece of concrete evidence survived. Police enhanced a single recovered audio file. Beneath layers of heavy static, they identified the sound of the choir singing, followed by a faint whisper asking, "Has he brought the next choir?" Mason retreated to the mainland, refusing all interviews. For decades, he lived in absolute isolation, though neighbors repeatedly filed noise complaints, claiming they could hear a massive choir singing from inside his empty house late at night. In 2039, Mason vanished. Investigators found his front door wide open, with muddy tracks leading from his bedroom directly into the ocean. The only new item in his home was sitting in the center of the living room, a freshly carved, completely blank gravestone. Today, the Scottish government strictly prohibits any civilian vessels from approaching the island. Still, Coast Guard crews operating in the sector routinely log reports of faint choir music drifting across the water during heavy fog. The voices continue to echo across the coast. Local fishermen believe that if the singing ever goes completely silent, it is a sign that the count is complete and the entrance is ready to open again.